Okay, let's talk about sharpening a little bit. Now, in this context, I'm talking about sharpening outside of turning tools. And we'll look at that in a moment. One of the things with turning tools, your lathe chisels, is you don't want to put a super fine polished edge on them. You want what's referred to as a burr. And the reason for that is if you think about how many times that lathe goes around, and if you've got a super sharp edge, it doesn't last very long. Now that's the reason you're going to see most of your lathe tools are made out of high-speed steel. They're not made to be, they're made to be easy to sharpen. And like anything else, if you can't sharpen, you got a problem. You know, if you're a new woodworker and you pick up a hand plane and it's dull and you don't know how to set it up and whatever, it can be one of the most frustrating things you'll ever deal with. Same thing with a chisel or anything else. However, if you know how to sharpen them, that makes a big difference. Now, sharpening has come a long way in my day. The way we used to do it, and did it forever, was what's referred to today as the scary sharp way. Now, trust me, when it says scary sharp, it means you can flat get them sharp. Now, and I'm talking about like your chisels, your plane irons, things of that nature. But before we get into that, let's look at some others. In the router segment, I was telling you with a router bit, one of the things you want to do is you want to keep it sharp. One of my favorite things is to use a diamond hone. And again, particularly, this is the surface you want to focus on right here. And the biggest thing is to keep the mineral off of it, to keep the pitch built up off of it. And again, they make a whole lot of products out here that do that. One of my favorite, the one that's not designed for this, as I keep telling you about, is good old crud cutter. It'll flat clean it. Now, we don't have much on here, but you get the point. And you hone it. I also told you that if it's sharp enough that you can actually kind of scrape and get a shaving off of a fingernail. Yeah, that's actual fingernail. That's not just dirt. It works. It'll do good. Keeping it clean. Now your table saw blades, if you want them sharpened, I'm going to again tell you, you really need to find a good professional sharpener. But this is a blade. You can see the pitch and all on the teeth. I just sprayed it just a little second ago, just a little bit of crud cutter. It's actually, you let them soak a little bit, it's that easy. But then you've got the face of the teeth. You can also come back and take a diamond hone and just barely get in here and touch them. Get my bottle out of the way, sorry. And just basically what you're after is cleaning that face, just like that router bit, just touch it. But getting the pitch off of it is the main objective. That's one of the things that will make a blade that's actually not that dull appear to be, is keeping that pitch off of it. Okay, the good old scary sharp method is using some silicon carbide or wet dry sandpaper, whatever you want to call it. There's a couple pieces of 600. Here's a piece of 1200. You can buy it up to about 2500 grit. And a good source for it is to check your local auto body supply. They'll carry it, and usually they'll sell you just a sheet or two, whatever you need. You don't have to buy a big pack of it. You can order it different places, but you can get it up to a pretty fine grit. There's another one that you can find out there. It's called micro mesh. Now, micro mesh is a micron grit, meaning This says it's 8,000, and I forget exactly now what that equates to, but it's pretty fine. Now you can buy all kinds of jigs to hone your chisel with, that hold the chisel at a proper angle and whatever. And you know, I've got a couple of them around here, but this ought to tell you something. I don't know exactly where they're at. That's just a piece of cherry 2x2. And I cut an angle on it. Now the angle is usually pretty steep. Your chisels are going to normally be 20, 25 degrees on the end. But all you have to do to figure this out is just lay your chisel down, flat on, get it flat to the surface, draw you a line, bandsaw it, then sand it to where you want. What you're after is that the chisel sits flat down on the stone. Again, now, depending upon what you're doing, usually a little water kind of keeps that sandpaper from sliding around. Now, this is pretty fine. And even though I'm sanding the wood a little bit, it's not going to matter. I'm having a hard time holding it straight because I'm not situated. Normally I would be up here with both hands on it like this. And I always did it on the back stroke. And the reason for that is if I go forward, I can catch my paper and tear it. I've also been known just to freehand them. Now to make sure you're doing good, take your magic marker and I really like that because if you look right here, the magic marker will come off on the water very quickly and it tells me when I've got my tip down correct. Now this doing something that fine, that's just for really honing it and cleaning it up. And don't forget to do the back. And you can tell how quick this works because you can see the metal, the black, you see the metal coming off. Can you see that? Works really good. Then you can take a ceramic stone. Now there's going to be a question, do you like oil or water? I like the waters. And it's just because they're easier to clean. But I can do the exact same thing. And really give it a fine, super fine edge. Basically, that's just, I'm just polishing here with this ceramic stone. The ceramic stones are not cheap, but they do a nice job. Now when I'm done, one of the things I like to do is to put a little bit of wax on the chisel. And the reason for that is, I don't know about you, but I'm always in there a little bit. It seems like I'm going to clean a little bit of glue or something. I get it on my chisel. And the wax will make it come off good. But if you get a little glue on your chisel, two things. One, the crud cutter will help take it off. Excuse me. And the second thing is, you can actually stick the chisel, I wouldn't do the handle, in some really hot water, even if it's a waterproof glue, but a wood glue, something like Type Bond 3 or something, it'll clean it off. It'll soften and you can take your fingernail and scratch it off. Now, my ultimate favorite, and if you're a new person, this is your deal. This is the Worksharp 3000. It kind of took the guesswork out of sharpening. And it's a dry system. And again, all you have to do is put a little bit of magic marker on the tip, because there are different angles. And set your chisel in here and just lightly turn it. And you'll be able to look and see where it's striking. Now you see that? See this? It's touching right on the edge. That means my bevel is too high. I need to come up. I took the magic marker right off the tip of the chisel. That's what I'm showing you. That means the chisel's sitting too low down in the machine. There's a little indicator on the side. This should be. Let's see if I'm right. There we go. Now what I'm doing on this chisel is I'm picking up right here and I'm picking up right here. So I'm actually flattening this. That's what I want. As long as I don't go too hard and too fast, because this is a dry system, I don't want to get the chisel really hot. But I'm not going to worry about that metal. Over the time, that's going to wear it, and that's going to come off anyway. I want that edge. Then I can actually lay it up here. And in this case, I've got a 6,000 on the bottom of this disc. I've got a 3,600 on the top. And I have a sharp chisel. I can do the exact same thing with a plane iron. Again, just set your bevel and you're good to go. Now, the discs that come with these, you can get, I think it goes all the way down to 80, and it's a glass disc under here. And I mean, you can take a chisel that's just beyond, I mean, you can take something that looks like somebody been out here cutting nails and chiseling concrete with it, and you can restore the chisel to a nice workable chisel. It really does. If you really want to know if your chisel's sharp, you should be able to take a piece of hardwood, and when you slice it on an end grain, and it's hard for me to get a position here, but it's going to slice it pretty readily, and the wood's going to look wet. Can we see that? The wood looks wet, and it feels very smooth. That's a sharp chisel. Now, can I take this chisel, and they also make a leather strop for it. Leather will just polish it a little bit more, and they make a little compound for it. You know, if you ever been to the jewelers and you take a ring, they polish it on a wheel with some polishing compound. It's basically what it does. What you have to be careful of, though, when you're stropping, is that you don't round off your chisel. Now, my preference in chisels, this happens to be a set of Ashley Owls. They're kind of my go-to chisels in woodworking. But I also have a set of Marples, and I have a couple sets of the Wood River planes, and we use them in classes because, again, a lot of times we'll grab a chisel and we're scraping glue or cleaning a little glue or something. I'm not going to use my Ashley Owls for that unless I'm forced to. But it happens upon occasion. But there's a lot of really good chisels out here. You know, the Ashley Owls, one of the reasons I like them is that they're a very thin blade. And if you get into doing hand-cut dovetails and something like that, they make getting in some small, tight dovetails really easy. Now, one of the things I forgot to mention when we were talking about the router bits is you can just take, this is a little router bit oiling thing, but you can just take a little 3-in-1 oil. You can also clean your bearings and put a little bit of oil in them. That's something you want to do. Keep your bearings clean and running well too. Okay? All right. The next one we want to talk about is scrapers. Now I sharpen scrapers a little bit different. But I kind of use that scary sharp method again. Normally I just use some 600. Now one of the things with a scraper has to have a burr on it. When you take a scraper, it's nothing more than a piece of metal. You want this edge to be 90 degrees to the face. And you want this edge to start, you want it smooth. The object of the game is to roll this edge over and make a little hook on it, or burr. And that's what creates the cutting edge. Now, the same thing applies is I'll take it and lay it on something flat. Now what I'm doing now is removing the old burr. Then the other side. And just a piece of wood. This is going to now flatten and make that face 90 degrees. But you want to make sure this is square in here. That's going to polish and make that edge face 90 degrees. Now, for the most part, you have nothing. Then that's where you get a burnisher. Now they make burnishers. This is a store-bought burnisher. But you know what? You can take a good old round screwdriver and do the same thing. This is where people make a mistake. What you're going to do is you want to roll this as straight as you can. You're just polishing that edge. Camera girl's not going to like this because she don't like metal scraping. But here we go. Then the little angle, little more angle. I'm pressing pretty hard. And when I feel it, I start to feel that burr start to form. What I'm doing is I'm rolling that corner, that edge around. It doesn't take a lot. And then, see, I could go a little bit more. You don't want to get that hook to where you have to lay it down real low. The finer the hook, like we have here, the smoother the finish. Make sense? That's how we handle scrapers. And it doesn't matter whether you're doing a gooseneck, whether you're doing any kind of scraper. It's the same thing. It's getting that edge flat. Now, if you've got a gooseneck, thought I had one, sorry. If you've got a gooseneck or a curved one, just hold this straight in them, your burnisher, and go across the edge. That'll flatten it. Then angle it and create your burr. Which scrapers do we like? There's one out here, I think it's called Garlic, Garlic. That's one. And there's another one, I can't remember the name of it. But they all do pretty much, they all do excellent. Lee Nielsen makes a set, and they're nice, but they are very thin blade, and they do a nice job. I like the little heavier blades just because I'm able to roll that edge and I can just work it a little bit better than I can the fine, but I've got the fine and they do excellent. And I also think with the thin ones, you can get a little finer, smoother cut with them. So I do like them a lot. I'm not putting them down at all. That's outside of this is our sharpening. This is as far as we go. We just don't, you can, like anything else, you can really take it to an extreme, but if I could polish something up with the micro mesh sandpaper using the Scary Sharp, or go to 6,000 grit on the Work Sharp, they're pretty sharp. They're pretty nice. Okay, that's sharpening. That's how we do it. All right, marking and measuring. Sounds like a pretty simple enough concept, and For the most part, it is. One of the biggest keys, everybody's going to use a tape measure. I kind of prefer the Stanleys, and I don't, because I do furniture so much, I don't usually use much over. I usually use the 12 or the 16 foot. But anyway, the biggest thing I see is where guys take, we all know about the little loose end on here, and guys keep hammering it and slamming it, and sooner or later that loosens up. And everybody here probably knows what's called the inching it. And that's simply where you start with the inch mark. And for example, this is now showing me this is 7.5, but because I inched it, I know it's 6.5. Now I'm measuring the same, but just make sure of that. Again, tape measure, not difficult. We do a fair amount of turning, and when we're doing that, sometimes we got to do segmenting, or better put, we got to do fluting and reeding and whatever. I guess this is just a dressmaker of sewers, seamstress rule, and it's flexible. And what I can do with it on something round is I can go around it and get a measurement. Now, for example, this is 11 inches round. Then I can take a set of dividers, if I really want to get good and accurate, and at 11 inches, that would be, we'll just figure it out. We'll just do it. 11 inches would be what? Every how many times I want to do it, let's just go about, let me just try it, 2 1/4 real quick. But we're talking about marking it, and what I can do to get real accurate is I can set it up here, mark, and mark. And I'm off a little bit. Okay, but anyway, camera girl says 2 3/4. She's probably right. But a set of dividers for laying it out. And the same thing applies if you're doing a set of dovetails. You can measure never how you want to lay them out. You can take a set of dividers just for equal spacing. Mark. I got closer on that and didn't even measure. But you get the gist. The other thing we use a lot is, you always want a fixed something, a fixed measurement. A fixed tool means something metal, nice for laying out, marking. You want something good and accurate. We've got all kinds here. The better, the more accurate, the better. Meaning, the better ones. A yardstick, a wooden yardstick from that they're giving away at the hardware store might be a little bit of a stretch. You want a good square when you're laying out and you're marking to make sure things mark and are accurate and straight. And particularly like if you're doing dovetails, and we'll look at that in a little while, and you're wanting to lay lines out, most time what you're going to use there is an angle gauge. Again, you want a good one. And when you're laying out your baseline, I use this all the time. I use a knife. I carry a pocket knife with a knife sharp point and blade on it. I use this more than I use anything else for really extreme accuracy. That cut line is a big deal. When you're laying out dovetails, the same thing. You can mark them. But if you take a knife and you draw them, there's something that happens. And you do it backwards on camera. Oops. crazy. There we go. Wasn't quite as crazy as I thought, just had to get it right. But when you mark it with a knife, a good sharp knife, the thing it does is when you're, particularly anything you have to chisel or pare is the term. Pare means cutting down. When you do that, that cut line will create you a cut that your chisel will sit in, and it makes guiding that chisel much easier. Make sense? It's very hard to see because that line is so small. Now you're going to see out here a lot of guys use marking gauge. And this is the one we used. This is one made by Jeff Hamilton. I think it's Hamilton Tool Works. It's handmade by Jeff. One of the things I like about these, rather than have the wheel that just marks, is it has a knife. And the knife cuts. The same thing talking about using that knife. That cut line is what's going to give you all the difference in the world. When you can make that slice, again, it's a finer line, more detailed, and if you have to chisel to it, it gives you something for your chisel to set in as a guide. Creates that little teeny valley for the tip of that chisel. If you're doing turning, and we do, again, a fair amount, they make them plastic, everything. They make a center finder. Works really cool. Now, this has been turned, but you can just put it, rotate around, marking, and it's going to find your center. If you don't have one of these, you can also take a simple combination square and do the same thing. And just start marking it. Typically you're going to mark 4 points. Go ahead and mark 5 or 6 points. That's going to make sure you're in the center. When you're turning, you've got calipers that measure outside diameters, inside diameters, you name it. It's always good to have several of them around, particularly if you're hand turning something, so that you can set them up. If I'm turning dowels or I'm turning something small, one of the things I really like to use that sounds kind of crazy to measure with is something like an open-end wrench. You can take an adjustable wrench as well, open it up to whatever you want, and that becomes your caliper for testing your diameter. Now, when you're marking something, there's times when you're building something and you want to make something a little bigger. And a lot of guys will take and use a compass to mark it with. And they'll set it like so. And then they'll come in and they'll draw it. The problem with this is, unless this stays 90 degrees to that face and this area in here is straight, it's not going to track correctly. The easiest, the simplest way, now you can go out here and you can buy fancy. These are some guides for Veritas. But you can also just take a simple washer, as long as the inside is ever how much you want to enlarge. You could take a large washer, and usually one of my favorite tools for marking is a little 5mm lead pencil or mechanical, and this sets in here, and if you use the wheel is going to always give you a perfect mirror image. And again, it doesn't matter if it's the fancy one or the washer. That's how you can transfer and enlarge a pattern. Make sense? Okay, that's about it on measuring and marking. It's just not complicated. One of the big things is to whatever you're using, use it consistently. Meaning, if you're using a tape measure, use the same one. You know, that way if it's off a little bit or something, it's just not going to make a big difference because everything will be consistent. All right, guys, let's talk a little bit about construction. Here's two different pieces. This is the kitchen cabinets, and what we've got in here when we put the face frame together, we used a loose tenon or a domino from Festool. They're pricey, but they do a nice job, and you'll see that. The other thing that we did when we attached the face frames on these, what I did was I glued it, kind of hard to see, and I actually came back, very hard to see. I came back and I simply stapled, now I glued it, and I stapled the face frame on. Now, why would I not use something like a brad nail? Well, they don't hold that well. A staple holds better. And again, these are getting painted. I want to emphasize that. This isn't something I would do if I was dyeing it or staining it. But, and I clamped it good and tight, stapled the face frame on, let the glue dry. But one of the things we did when we built this Carcass and when we did the face frame is you want to use what's called a squaring caul. This simply sets in here. This is a piece of MDF that we cut a corner out. That's just so nothing interferes. And that's also so we can see in the corner if we get some glue squeeze out. But when you're done, we put it on the case like this. Of course, another one here, and sometimes we put it down here in the bottom. Now, the reason for that is what that's going to do is it's going to hold our Carcass square while the glue and everything dries. Pretty simple. Square is important. And with that said, we've already talked about this. You want a good square. This is a Pinnacle one. There's a company out here called Woodpeckers. They make some of these extruded aluminum ones, and these are just nice, heavy squares. I try to avoid the squares from the box stores and whatever, and the reason I try to do that, I think she didn't see my square. And the reason I do that is, I'm gonna tell you up front, oftentimes they're not square. Just saying. I mean, a lot of the box store stuff, you know, when these in construction of houses and carpentry and things like that, tolerances aren't quite as tight as they are when you get into furniture and high-end cabinetry and whatever. So a good square is important. The squaring caul makes a huge difference. It's definitely something you want to do. But in this case, also, there's something else you need to note. This is very important. One of the things we do, it doesn't matter what we're building or how we're building it. In this particular case, there's going to be a piece of plywood sets in this dado all the way around. That's going to be our back. Now the big deal here is that the reason we don't want a back in it is because when we finish it, it's very, very difficult. Now we spray most of our finishes, but even if you're wiping or brushing, trying to get in and get in the sides and the corners, very difficult. To be able to finish this, and what we'll do is we'll take a piece of masking tape, tape off the dado. We don't want to get a finish where we're going to be gluing, and we can glue this solid because it's plywood. Plywood doesn't expand and contract. That's its purpose. With that said, if we look over here at this big case, this case is what's called frame and panel. Oops. And the way this is done, raised panels, inset into face frames. This handles expansion and contraction because each raised panel in here is a little narrower than the inside opening where the slots are. just like we looked at that door when we made the door. The panel's made a little narrower. So this allows the panel to expand and contract independently. If this was one great big piece of cherry, this piece of cherry could expand and contract across its width easily an eighth, probably 3/16, and that's between a winter and a summer. Meaning humidity. What makes wood move again is moisture. You know, in the winter you've got the heat and everything on. The house is drier than it is in the summer when the humidity's higher. Let me put it like this. If you're cold, your wood's going to shrink. If you're sweating, it's going to expand. That simple. But here's our issue with this one. We have to do all this interior. And if I make the top and the bottoms and everything out of solid wood, then they're going to want to expand and contract, and the side isn't. So what we did in this case, we're going to be finishing it, but in this case what we did is we actually made a box out of plywood, just like that kitchen cabinet, and then we put our cherry panels on the outside. So the only thing in this case right now that's going to be expanding and contracting is going to be the raised panel. Everything else is good to go. Now understand, you know, when you get your face frames and you've got something 2.5, 3 inches, you're just going to get such a minimal amount of movement, if any, that it's pretty much negligible. And that's the same thing here on this. You know, when you've got a face frame that's, you know, 1.5, 2 inches, again, you're not going to get enough movement. But when you get 20, 30 inches, 10 inches even, it's got to expand and contract. Here's a big key with this. If you're doing solid wood, one of the things you have to do is keep your grain in the same direction. You don't want to oppose grain. If this was larger, again, not too big, this would be like a face frame. But if this was a big top and you try to attach this to it and glue it, you're preventing this from moving. And when you do that, this is going to crack. It's a given. You have to make provision for it to move. But if in the same token, no matter how wide it is, if our grain is all going the same direction, we don't have an issue, because it all moves together. There's a lot of information out here on expansion and contraction. A lot of people choose to ignore it. Don't. All right, let's talk a little bit about basic, and I emphasize basic, joinery. You know, probably one of the first places most any woodworker will start is with what's called a screw and plug. Now, what am I talking about? Well, here's the way it works. You simply take, and this is a more common one, you can buy, you've got your little countersinks, and they come in different sizes. You can get quarter, you can get 5/16, and this is a 3/8. 3/8 is probably more popular. And what you do is you drill it. Go down fairly deep. Fairly deep, meaning a quarter or so, depending upon the thickness of your wood. And then you screw it together. Now, let me explain something. When you're gluing this is an end grain. End grains, think of it as a handful of straws. They're very porous. Woods like oak and whatever, more so. But what happens is when you put glue on it, the glue is often absorbed into the end grain, and you get what's called a starved glue joint. What you want to do is take the glue and wipe it real good. Work it down into the end grain. Wipe it off, let it dry. Then let it dry, 20, 30 minutes. then come back and glue it again. The term is called sizing, and it makes for a much stronger joint. Now, one of the things we were talking about, expansion and contraction. Inasmuch as long as I've got the grain running the same direction, it's not going to be an issue. But one of the things that happens, if you notice, this hole's about 1/8 of an inch. Something that happens when you put a screw in with something like that is that oftentimes that screw starts to thread into the piece, to this piece, the piece that the screw's going through. When it does that, it can push back and try to push the joint apart rather than pull it together. Trick I've always used is to make the hole just big enough that the screw will pass through unobstructed. This makes it so when this goes down, it pulls. Now, most people will use some form of a power driver or whatever to put a screw in. Drills are typically it. This is a little impact driver, and it's kind of like a little hammer. Now, the other thing, we always, wherever possible, we use square drive screws. Now, on a small piece like this, where I'm narrow, I'm very susceptible to splitting the piece of wood if I get that screw in. So a little pre-drill is a good idea. In this case, you just want to use something that's a little bit smaller, that's smaller than the screw. You hear that little hammer? What that's doing is that just really seats that screw and it keeps it from twisting the head out. Then we plug it. This is called a plug cutter. Now you can buy them pre-made, but you can buy the plug cutters in all kind of different sizes as well. And you use it in a drill press. Now I prefer these over the store-bought ones because then typically I can take a piece of scrap and in the drill press I'm going to drill some plugs. And what we're going to do, once we've drilled them, we just simply take a screwdriver and pop them out. Now again, it drills a tapered plug. And that means it's going to be tapered from the top is the narrow part. And you put it in and align it with the grain. Now normally you would glue it. When your glue's dry, you sand it off. But there's a point here. You notice I picked up a little hammer to drive that. Could I use the mallet? Yeah, in this case I probably could. But one of the things, just so you know, mallets, this is the dead blow mallet, meaning it's got a lead shot in it. It's designed to be able to tap your wood and not damage it. Hammer, on the other hand, it's going to damage your wood. But by the same token, if you're driving a nail or something, or you'll see in a moment, if you're driving a peg, I much prefer the hammer. The reason for it is because this is softer, it can bounce. The hammer is more likely, is going to seat it and set it faster. Let me walk over and sand this off just a moment. Let me show it to you first. Now I'm going to go sand it off, and you'll see what I'm talking about. All right, this is kind of just a very quick. It's just a plug and screw. And it holds fairly well, pretty well. Now, one of the things you want to make sure of is that you go, you know, this is 2 pieces of 3/4 to scrap, but I would use at least 1.5 inches. You want to get down in this wood fairly well because you're attaching into an end grain. End grains don't hold a screw as well as a flat grain, which is your flat surface. End grain, flat grain. Okay, let me get another. Let's just, well, that's all right, we can go ahead. The other one out now, real popular, is called a pocket screw. And it's made by a company called Craig. They've been around a long time. Matter of fact, I was familiar with pocket screws before they ever got real popular. And what you do is you set your little jig, and they have all kind of professional jigs and everything, and you have a drill bit, again 3/8, and it's got a pilot point. And when you get them, it's going to show you where to set your stop and where to set your jig for different thicknesses of wood. Now, just as you would do using the plug method, you're going to want to glue this. And you're going to want to size it. Now, one of the issues with the pocket screw is they can try to move around a little bit on you. They can try to shift a little bit. Let me grab a special pair of vice grips and I'll show you how. All right, I'll show you these clamps in a minute, but basically it's what we call a welder's clamp. It's kind of a C thing, and it's got an end on it that's designed to set in the hole to hold everything together. Now again, one of the issues with these is oftentimes because the screw goes in on an angle, it can try to pull it off a little bit. This is a good place for a dado to help you, which we'll look at. But you can also use some type of little backer clamped in behind here just to keep the wood from being able to slide. Now, do you see how that pushed back? It's also a candidate for doing the same thing. Now, one of the other things you can do to keep it from pulling off is to kind of make this piece just a little proud. Proud means just a little bit above the surface, just something to compensate. Now, one of the things we had now, it's going to leave this hole, but they also make plugs, specially made in different species. I didn't get that one all the way down, did I? I stripped out a little bit. Let me get another one. When that happens, you get a screw stripped out like that. But the best way to fix it is put a toothpick in it. Now you can see right here it's down below the surface a little bit where I did not put the backer on it. Just a little bit right here. You see that? Now, we'll be looking at dados. If we had a dado in here, the dado will also keep it from sliding back. And dados add strength. And we'll talk about that. All right, now I'm going to show you one of my little tricks. I like to do. Kind of the same principle of doing the plug, except we do it just a little bit different. You know, one of the things that you're going to run into, whether you nail it, whether you screw it, trying to cover that up is difficult. You know, you can fill it, never works real well. The plugs do very well, but you can find them usually. They're not that perfect, if you will. What I'm about to show you, you know, if you go back and you start looking at old antique furniture and stuff like this, these guys, they were often put together with wooden pegs. And ironically, the pegs were square. So I'm one of these, I'm of the opinion, you know, if you can't hide it, flaunt it. Very simple. So I'm going to show you how I do that. All right, I got my correct bit. One of the things I like to use, this is called a trim head screw. I don't know how, let me see how well you can see it here. And you can find them at even the box stores and whatever. And what they're used for, a lot of guys, carpenters and whatever, use them for installing trim and stuff. And they've got a little 1/4-inch head on them. Now in this case, and another thing they've got on the back of the head, they've got a little teeny, kind of a little blade thing that kind of helps it countersink. But the head isn't a whole lot bigger than the shaft, so you got to be careful drilling it. I usually use about 1/8 of an inch bit. But the cool thing about these is the way we handle hiding them. That 1/4 sawn popper is tough stuff. So now, the one thing with that is it used the number 8 screw that we just used just a minute ago, which is kind of the screw we typically go with, is a number 8. And it uses a number 2 square drive bit. Now, this one, because it's a small screw, it uses a number 1 bit. Just kind of, you know, I need to clamp this. I'll be right back. Now, actually, I could probably do this without a clamp, but I wanted to get the clamp because I want to mention something. When we glued up the panel that we used to show you the drum sander, we used a set of pipe clamps. But they've got these cabinet clamps out here. Now, this is a Jorgensen. Bessie makes them, Jet makes them, and you've got 2 parallel jaws. These, if you're doing cases, these things are really, really super nice to have because they will hold something square. All right, that's a little better. But again, holding that, being able to hold that square, that's a big deal. They really, really work nice. Now you notice something. I did not countersink with a screw. That little blade on the back, like I told you, will do it for you. Then what we do is we take and we cut a little 1/4 inch, depending on the screw, sometimes they're 3/16. We cut a little square peg. It's just a square. We just rip it on the table saw very carefully, use a push stick, and you notice we kind of taper the end a little bit. Now, what we do then, we would add some glue. And we drive it in. This is going to give us it's going to be an end grain. So this is actually going to give us an illusion that this thing is square pegged together, like the old timers. When you finish this, because it's an end grain, it will typically take a little darker color and it becomes an accent. Let me sand it off and I'll show you. All right, I put a little darker one. But now I said I sanded it off. Typically you're going to let the glue dry, then you're going to come back and saw them off, then sand them flush. But it makes for an interesting look. Pretty neat. Again, if you can't hide it, flaunt it. All right. Then we use the exact same procedure for something else, but we do this one a little different. When I'm doing something, we talked about expansion and contraction. And we talked about, and this is a perfect example, we have a molding that is running across the grain. In other words, the grain in the top is running left to right, but this molding is running across it. This sets us up for a problem area for expansion and contraction. If you glue that molding, this top's going to crack. How do you handle it? Well, you could actually use one of those little trim head screws, but that's not your best choice. Now, one of the things I hear a lot with woodworkers, and it kind of amazes me a little bit because they're like, man, I don't use no nails. I ain't using no nail. Well, you know, nails been around longer than anybody watching this can remember. Been around forever. And guess what, guys? Nails aren't broke. Let me show you something. What we'll do on a molding like that is we'll just take a finish nail and we'll nail it. Now let me explain something about a nail. A nail, of course, is steel. And so what a nail will do is it will flex with the wood. In other words, it'll bend with it. It'll let the wood expand and contract. Believe it or not, the expansion and contraction of wood is that strong. So what do? A little molding, using basically the same technique. All I'm going to do is I'm going to nail it. Don't go down far enough to hit your wood with your nail. Then just take a little nail set. And one of the things you're going to notice in the head of most any finished nail is a little dimple. And that dimple's made to hold a nail set. Get your nail set about 1/8 of an inch below the surface. Then, taking a number 2 square drive bit. You getting it? Take a number 2 square drive. Set the nail. Then, again, cutting the same little peg. Peg it. Now that's going to show again when it's stained, but it's going to appear as a wooden peg. There's no way you're going to fill it or plug it and completely hide it. So this allows us to, show it off a little bit. Now the question you're going to ask is, can I use a round dowel? Well, sure you can. You certainly can. I mean, they work fine. I use the square just because what I do is a lot of period furniture, and it was found in the old antique furniture. Okay. Continuing on a little bit with joinery, we have to talk about the modern day, well, they're not so modern now, but loose tenon joinery. The biscuit was one of the first ones out there. And we're going to come back, we're going to cut some biscuits and take a look at them, and we're going to look at the domino and take a look at it.